Think about taking your tube of toothpaste and wrapping the top of it with saran wrap. That's the original biofilm that's been there since middle birth. And then giving the toothpaste tube a little squeeze. What are you going to get? You're going to get a dome of toothpaste because the saran wrap's holding it in, right? So the dome is simply just biofilm trapping myofilm.
How's it going, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the 2020 podcast, bringing clarity to business, entrepreneurship, and life. Thank you again for taking the time to join me here to learn and to grow. Today's episode is an interview with Dr. James Rynerson. Now, if you're not familiar with that name, I am sure you're familiar with the product that name is attached to, which is the BlephEx device. If you're an optometrist, if you're in the dry eye space, you for sure are very familiar with BlephEx. And so in this conversation, I go into a lot of detail with Dr. Rynerson about where the BlephEx started, what the origins were, how he created it, how he designed it, what it's like as a CEO of a company like this. Also his theory behind dry eye and blepharitis, what he calls the DEBS theory. And we have some candid conversation about kind of what the pushback was on this theory, what other people in the dry eye space thought of it, and how they've come around now, and how he explains these different aspects of his theory, as well as what it's been like as a CEO and founder of a company in the eye care industry. So whether you're into the nerdy science of things, whether you like the founder perspective or the business perspective, I think we covered that full gamut of topics here in this conversation. Dr. Rynerson was really kind to answer all my questions. I think you'll really enjoy this conversation. If you do, as always, please share it, take a screenshot, put it up on your Instagram story. Let me know what you thought. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe and like and leave a comment. Again, let me know what you thought. Thanks again, guys. I look forward to talking to you again in the next episode. Hope you like this one. See you later. Well, Dr. Rynerson, thank you so very much for joining me here on the 2020 podcast. I appreciate you taking the time. Even though we're all in some form of quarantine, I know we're all still keeping pretty busy. So thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure, Javier. Thank you.
I thought I'd start with, for those in the audience who may not be familiar with you, I know most people who are listening are very familiar with the product, but I'd love for you to tell us about yourself, a little bit of background, perhaps where you went to school and kind of leading up to designing BlephEx.
Sure. Well, I graduated from medical school in 1990, University of Louisville. I did my ophthalmology residency at LSU, and then went on to practice, mostly private practice, for about 20 years. And it was during that private practice that I developed BlephEx. We get out of our training programs, and we're sort of taught in all of our training programs that if you have a patient come in and they're complaining about any eye irritation, you look at the slit lamp and you see what we used to call scurf. A lot of us still do. I'm trying to get everybody away from that term. But you see scurf, and it was immediate diagnosis. Oh, scurf, it's blepharitis. And I was doing that like everyone else, because that's kind of what you learned in your residency and training programs. And so I was seeing that, like everyone else, like every other patient seemed like. And I was treating it like everyone else. Artificial tears for dry, and try this drop and this sample. You go to the sample cabinet, you get a bunch of samples here, try something until you find something that works, right? Go home, do your baby shampoo scrubs, just like we're taught. And these patients never seem to get better. So you start questioning the time you spend with the patient in the chair, trying to describe it, trying to coach them through how to treat it. And you start ignoring the disease, unfortunately, like so many of us. You just want to run away from those blepharitis patients because they're a thorn in your side. They never get better. They just get worse. All they do is complain, as it turns out, rightfully so. But I didn't like practicing medicine that way, not wanting to hear the patient's problems and symptoms and complaints and stuff, and not being able to do anything about it. Well, one day I had a little old lady walk into my practice. Her name was Miss Perry. I'll never forget her. She was probably 85 years old, and was probably 90 pounds soaking wet. And I'd been on her for several years because her eyes were really a mess. Her lids were red, and they were starting to get a little ectropion and always looking nasty. And every time I'm coaching her, do your lid scrubs, here, let me try a different drop. And we'd already been through the antibiotics and all that, steroids. And she came in again, and again, I'm starting to coach her. Well, you're not doing your scrubs, Miss Perry. You've got to do your scrubs at home. And I guess she'd had enough of that. And she looked at me, and I'll never forget, she says, damn it, Dr. Rynerson, I'm 85 years old. I've got a tremor. I don't want to be anywhere around my eyelids doing anything. She says, you're the eye doctor. Why aren't you cleaning my lids for me? And that was really a profound question because I had no good answer for it. Why wasn't I cleaning her lids for her? Mm-hmm. Here, I'm an ophthalmic surgeon. I'm doing wedge resections and tarsal strip procedures. I'm doing intraocular cataract surgeries and glaucoma surgeries, everything in and around the eye. Why wasn't I doing a simple cleaning procedure for this patient? Certainly, I could do a better job than she could at home, right? So I thought, well, the reason is because I haven't got anything to really do it with. I tried it with Q-tips. That was always a failure. That didn't get me anywhere. So I decided to create a device I could use in the office that would spin at a very high speed, use a little soaked swab in a solution. And I was convinced that I could do a better job than she could.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did. I tinkered around. I made a little prototype, and I started treating patients. And lo and behold, they said, I haven't felt this good in ages. I mean, it worked fantastic. The blepharitis symptoms slowly went away, and some patients went away pretty quickly. So I thought, oh, that's great. I've got a new device. I've got a new treatment for this problem disease we've never been able to really treat before. And then I started charging for it. Well, that was a good thing. I'm making money with the time I'm doing now. I've got a new revenue source. But then something interesting happened. After doing that for about a year, in patients who had come in for the repeated treatments, they started telling me, Doctor, I don't know what you did. You sort of fixed that blepharitis thing by doing that treatment, but I'm not using artificial tears anymore. You also fixed my dry eye disease. Mm. Now, remember, Javier, back then, everyone thought that blepharitis was some separate disease than dry eye. You know, it was these two separate diseases. Even still, you'll hear people talk about overlapping disease presentations, and it's dry eyes, this conglomerate, this mixture of different diseases. So I thought, well, I'm treating blepharitis. Why is the dry eye getting better? I thought that's very, very interesting. So that's when I started researching, and that's when I decided really to take BlephEx to the market, get a patent, and launch it. And we did that in 2013 and haven't looked back. It's been very, very well received.
2013 is actually more recent than I expected, because to me it feels like it's been on the market for so long. For some reason, I had no idea that it was that recent. I thought it was much longer than that. I guess that means you've been doing a really good job on the marketing side.
We've been after, but you know something? Most of our marketing isn't really any paid advertising. It hasn't been any print ads, anything like that. It's just been word of mouth because it's so intuitive. It makes so much sense. You know, the gold standard with blepharitis treatment was always lid hygiene. We just had the wrong people doing it. It shouldn't be the patient doing it. It needs to be the doctor or a technician doing it.
Right.
So it's no real different. The standard of care is still clean the lids. It's just now there's a way to do it the way it's supposed to be done, the way it should be done.
Absolutely.
So it's really caught on quickly.
So the idea of BlephEx came before your research and your description of the biofilm and the effect of the biofilm on blepharitis, or was it kind of simultaneous? How did that work out?
Right. And that's a great question. It's really interesting how that works. So no, I invented BlephEx first with just the thought that I was going to do a better job removing scurf. Right? I could do a better job of cleaning lids than patients could do. And it wasn't until after I realized the amazing effect it had on dry eye patients that I thought there's more to this than meets the eye. And I started really diving in, not doing any kind of studies or research, diving into the current studies and research that have been out there for years to try to figure out what in the world I was doing along the eyelid margin that made such a difference. And, lo and behold, as much as I researched, I couldn't find out really what scurf was. No one knew. They just said, oh, it's debris. It's accumulated dead skin cells. Oh, maybe it's keratin. It's this or that. And I thought, well, there has to be something more to scurf than meets the eye.
Right.
And that's when I came across a website called Montana State University Center for Biofilm Engineering. Now, anybody who wants to learn about biofilms, go to Montana State University Center for Biofilm Engineering. That's where I learned everything I know about biofilms.
Yeah.
Because I learned that biofilms in nature, or anytime there's bacteria present, there will be a biofilm. They don't live outside of a biofilm. A bacteria, as a little single-celled organism, it won't survive.
Right.
It has to have a biofilm as its fortress.
Right.
So that's when the first light bulb kind of went ding, went on. I thought, wait a minute, scurf? No, it's biofilm, and it has to be there.
Right.
Because in nature, if you have a surface, that's the lid margin, and you have moisture, that's tears, and you have biofilm, that's our normal flora, you will get a biofilm virtually 100% of the time.
Right. Right.
Now, no one's ever sort of said that before, but it has to be there. So that was the first step.
Yeah, it's interesting that it makes a lot of sense when you just say it like that, right? But for some reason, it initially doesn't quite click that it's not like there's little just individual bacteria living there in their own little homes, right? They are together. And it's funny when I started to kind of look back into biofilm, and my initial memory was, it was unfortunately a bit of a negative memory of like undergraduate biology or something like that I didn't do very well in that class. But then I started to read up on it a little bit more, and of course then it started to make sense. And one thing I just wanted to read this because I thought this was funny, and this is part of the reason why I had that negative memory was when you Google or look something up on the internet, one of the first sites you end up on is Wikipedia, right? And I just wanted to find what is the definition of a biofilm. So it says, a biofilm comprises any syntrophic consortium of microorganisms in which cells stick to each other and often to a surface. And it's not the most pleasant and easy to read sentence, but I was hoping maybe you could break that down. I know you have already a little bit, but for maybe in sort of layman's terms, what does that mean on our eyelid?
Yeah, well, great question also. So we all have biofilms on our lid margin. Every single living soul on this planet has a biofilm, because as soon as the lid margin is colonized with normal flora bacteria, and that happens probably shortly after birth, to be honest, they start building biofilm immediately, because that's their home. They have to have a biofilm to survive in. So, a 6-month-old probably has the biofilm. We all do. But they're so thin, they're translucent. It's this polysaccharide, so it's a sugar type compound. And it's so tightly adherent to the lid margin that you really never see it. It really has to accumulate in vast quantities before we start identifying it as what we call scurf, or this layer. Some people say keratinized, also another poor term to use. But it really has to be there in significant volume to be able to see it. Otherwise, you just don't see it.
Right.
We all have it. We don't know it. We don't see it. We don't see it in our kids. We don't see it in ourselves most of the time. But we all have it. Bacteria make this biofilm such that it sticks to the eyelid margin. I call it a bacterial superglue. So it's a molecule called an adhesin molecule they create. And the adhesin molecule is responsible for making sure the biofilm sticks together and sticks to whatever surface they build it on. Because bacteria don't want to spend years building a biofilm only to have it slough off easily and, wash away into the environment. So they make sure they stick it to what they found to grow on. And in our case, it's the lid margin. So the adhesin molecule sticks that biofilm to the lid margin, be it in a 6-month-old or in an 80-year-old. They all have biofilm stuck to the lid margin that we just really can't see. So that's how they're able to survive there, without causing any problems, I must say, until the biofilm reaches a certain thickness. So they go about building the biofilm, building, and they're not causing any inflammation. They're not producing any toxins or virulence factors. And it's very interesting why they do not do that. You might think, well, why don't they start producing some of these virulence factors? They use the virulence factors to break down host tissue for more of a food source. But early on, they don't need a bigger food source. Early on, they're happy just surviving on what's in our natural tears and maybe sort of the dead skin cells as they slough off. And they don't produce any virulence factors. But the main reason they don't produce any virulence factors early on is because the host response would come in and essentially wipe them out. So bacteria are very smart. They're smarter than we give them credit for. Billions of years of evolution have allowed the bacteria to build a biofilm without toxins early on until they know they're thick enough to survive anything the host can throw at them.
Yeah.
And that's called quorum sensing gene activation. That was discovered at Harvard in 1968. So that's really an old theory, or an old bit of research that's been around for a while, that bacteria undergo quorum sensing gene activation. And that means when their biofilm's thick enough and there's enough of them, they start then producing toxins. Well, that typically doesn't happen until we're in our late teens, probably 20s. Then they start producing toxins to liberate more of a food source. So I first discovered the biofilm. The second part of that is, what do mature biofilms do? Well, they produce toxins and virulence factors because of quorum sensing gene activation. And once I put those three things together, it all just fell into place. The theory made perfect sense, and it was like, voila, this is it. This explains why we get dry eye disease, why in most children we don't have symptoms, don't have issues. In older people we do. It explains why contact lens wearers have it worse than anybody, because that potentiates the biofilm. It explained everything we see clinically. So that was the watershed moment once I started researching. And it wasn't before I developed BlephEx. It was only after, because I knew I was doing something that was not explained with current science.
Right. That's very intriguing to me, because it obviously, I feel that your intuition seems that it would be, you discover the biofilm and then you want something to clean it. Exactly. Or remove it, but it actually was the other way around. So I think that's kind of a cool story in that sense. Now, you've already touched on it a few times, because we know that this is part of the sort of the process, right? The biofilm and then the inflammation and the dry eye. But I'd love for you to go through what you call the DEBS, if I'm not mistaken, the 4 stages of it. If you don't mind kind of explaining those 4 stages, beginning with the biofilm being there, and then the effect it starts to have on the eyelid.
Sure. Well, once I sort of put it together and figured out what was causing the dry eye disease, the bacteria building biofilms, the biofilm becoming thicker and mature, leading to quorum sensing gene activation, and then leading to the virulence factors being produced from more of a food source. Once I'd figured that out, I thought, there has to be a better way to talk about this. Because all eye professionals were talking about it as either blepharitis or dry eye disease or meibomian gland dysfunction or aqueous insufficiency. All these different terms were being used. Nothing really explained what was going on. And I thought, with this new knowledge we have about dry eye, we should be calling this disease, have one term for it that lets everyone know it's one disease instead of multi-overlapping diseases and all that nonsense. It's one disease. What would be a good name for it? And I thought, Dry Eye Blepharitis Syndrome, because it really is a syndrome. It has multiple different presentations, multiple times of our lifetime that it starts. It does different things depending on different structures, but it's one etiology induced by a biofilm. And I just thought Dry Eye Blepharitis Syndrome made more sense than anything else I heard. And it makes a nice anonym, the letters equal.
Yeah, right.
Blanking on the term, but DEBS, it makes a nice abbreviation for what the disease is, DEBS.
Yeah, except for anybody who's named Deb, I think might be a little upset with it.
But. Yeah, if your ex-wife is Deb, maybe you want to.
yeah.
But anyway, I thought that makes sense. Just call it DEBS, and it applies to everybody who has this biofilm-induced inflammation of the eyelid margin. And then it was a matter of the stages. Okay, we all know that it affects the meibomian gland, but that's in later patients. What's it doing earlier than that? Is there something that happens earlier that really helps us explain what we see at the slit lamp? Well, if you look at the anatomy of the eyelid, it becomes pretty easy to understand that the stages of DEBS really depend on the anatomical structure being affected. So if you think about it in terms of when it starts, when we're a child, you get just that layering on the lid margin, not causing any problems yet because it's too thin. But what's the easiest structure for that biofilm to invade? And the easiest structure is obviously the eyelash follicle, because there's a space beside the eyelash as it goes down into the eyelid. And there's a lash bulb down there. It's a very small little structure compared to other structures. So it would make sense that that's first. And indeed, you see that clinically. Because before you see meibomian gland disease, you'll see patients that have what we call a volcano sign. They'll have that pouting up, that where the tissue pouts up right there where the lash enters the eyelid margin. Right. And that indicates edema, something you've never really heard described before. call it a volcano sign, but no one really knew what that meant. Well, it's simply there because the lash bulb is edematous. There's inflammation now going on inside the lash bulb, down deep inside there.
Mm-hmm.
That's because that biofilm can accumulate more easily in that trap space. It reaches quorum sensing sooner, and you start getting virulence factors in an eyelash follicle. And that might lead to a little irritation, but by and large, it's rather asymptomatic. You'll see the swelling at the slit lamp. Now, to any doctors who are watching this, I challenge you to go back and start looking at your patients. Look at the base of the eyelash, and you'll be amazed. You'll be hard-pressed to find any normal-looking eyelid margins. You'll be hard-pressed to find any where the skin just comes in flat and then dives down along the lash follicle. They'll all come in and go up, indicating there's swelling in that area. I was putting together some of our materials showing the stages of DEBS and thought, well, I've got all the stages. I've got stage 1 through 4, but I need a normal, right? Well, I had thousands of pictures of eyelid margins on my phone from using my lash cam. All the trade shows I've ever been to, I'm always demonstrating it. Thousands of it. So I started looking for a normal. I couldn't find one. Every single lid had evidence of folliculitis, the edema around the base of the lash. So I called my 4-year-old son to come in the kitchen. Xander, come in here. I want to take a picture of your eyelids so I can have a normal, because he's only 4, right?
Yeah.
Lo and behold, he had some early folliculitis.
Wow.
Your doctors will see it in everybody if they know to look for it.
Right.
Which means pulling back on the slit lamp and looking at the base of the lash. All your contact lens wearers are going to have that.
Right.
So that's easy to understand. It's a small structure, easy to invade early on. It's folliculitis, stage 1. Now, what takes longer to invade? Well, the meibomian gland. It's also on the lid margin. It's right there where the biofilm is, but it's a smaller orifice, the little ductule to get down in there. You also have this constant efflux of meibum up out of that. So it takes longer to get the meibomian glands with biofilm within them than it does the lash follicle. So I thought that makes perfect sense. That's why we see lots of folliculitis, but meibomitis is less common. Still pretty common as you get older, which makes sense. It just takes longer to get down in that larger structure of the meibomian gland. It takes longer to get down in there and have an effect, but eventually it will.
Right.
Then what about the aqueous? Right? Because my feeling was it's part of the same disease. How does that tie in? I'll have doctors at my lecture sometimes say, well, that's way up in the fornices,
right.
the accessory aqueous glands of Krause and Wolfram. How does that play into it? That's not on the lid margin. Well, then you got to stop and think about it. Well, they are remote from the lid margin. Lid margin, that's going to happen first, follicles in my meibomian gland, but how do the aqueous glands get involved? Well, my theory is that the biofilm, look, it's like lava. Remember the pictures of Mount Kilauea on Hawaii, how the lava would slowly creep, down and they just plow down a house or a fence or a road. Nothing stops that stuff, right? Biofilm's the same way. You will not stop it. That's why it invades every orifice, follicle, glands of mold, meibomian glands. But my thinking is it also probably creeps up the palpebral conjunctiva in a very thin, attenuated layer, never accumulating like it does on the margin, but a very thin layer, because all the blinking eye movement lids and all that, never really accumulates very thick, but acts as a thin bridge to the glands of Krause and Wolfram that are just above the, up in the fornices and above the meibomian plate. So that's how I think it gets there. But it has a second mechanism, if that ever turns out to be proven just true. It has a second mechanism because biofilms always seed their environment. Little bits always flecking off into the environment. Every day you have hundreds of little bits jumping off into the tear film.
Yeah.
It's not a stretch of the imagination to think that a little piece gets a toehold in the gland of Krause or Wolfram.
Right.
Then slowly invades that gland, does the same exact thing, accumulates within it, blocks it, and then with chronic inflammation, shuts it down.
Yeah.
So that's stage 3. And I can have your doctors prove that to themselves. Because every day in our practices, we see patients walk in with meibomian gland disease, and they're saying, my doctor, my eyes are burning. I'm tearing all the time. My water, I can't read very long. and they're hard to refract. It's always changing every time they blink. You know the patient. You know the routine. Every day we see those patients.
Yeah.
And you do a tear breakup time, and it's 1 or 2 seconds, and you say, well, you've got evaporative dry eye. And the patient always looks at you and says, doctor, weren't you listening? My eyes are watery.
Yeah.
I've got tears running down my cheek. How can I have dry eye when I've got all these tears? So you've got to explain that too much aqueous, not enough oil. You've got to explain that. So we know the drill, right? We see it all the time. Well, here's the kicker. If meibomian gland disease was a separate disease process than aqueous insufficiency, a separate disease, just an overlapping presentation as they've been telling us for decades.
Right.
If that was the case, wouldn't you expect at least once in a while to see aqueous insufficiency as a separate disease to show up in front of meibomian gland disease?
Mm-hmm.
But we never do. You never see the patient walking in with a drop of oil running down their cheek, tons of healthy meibomian glands, and no aqueous.
Mm.
You never see that. Not even in a Sjogren's, which is a whole different disease process, an autoimmune process. You still never see that. You don't see that. I thought, that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
What should that tell us? That should tell us that aqueous insufficiency is part of the same disease process. You can't get there till you've been through the meibomian gland part of it.
Right.
So that made perfect sense. And I think it's an attenuated biofilm creeping up the palpebral conch that reaches those. But that's not until you're 80 years old, right? Because we don't see that much aqueous insufficiency. And by that time, the meibomian glands are usually shot. Right. So that's why it's less common. It's in your older patients, about 15% of all dry eye.
Yeah.
So that's the first 3 stages. Then I'll throw a 4th stage in because these patients don't stop there. They don't stop with lash follicles and meibomians and aqueous glands being affected. The next thing that's affected is their nerves.
Mm.
How many times have you seen the little 85-year-old man walk in? His lids look like hell. They're terrible. They're red. They're drooping out. And he says, I don't have any symptoms, doc. I'm fine, right? Because he shot his nerves.
Right.
You get this inflammatory neuropathy. And then the tendons start going. The tendons that hold the eyelid in position.
Mm-hmm.
They become lax and loose, and then you get ectropion or you get entropion. So I think it's all part of the same disease process with one etiology, and that etiology is biofilm.
Right. Yeah, I think that's definitely a very intriguing way to look at it, because for sure we're still beat into us that it's different conditions that overlap, exactly how you said. And one thing I found interesting about that is, it seems like the consistent sort of ratio that's been said is 85% of patients with dry eye have some form of meibomian dysfunction, and then there's the 15% who are aqueous. But I've seen hundreds, and I don't know how many, if any, are simply aqueous. Like this, I found that interesting that you mentioned that. That made me think about the fact that I rarely, almost never, see simply aqueous deficient patients.
You won't see it. And if you look close, virtually all those aqueous insufficiency patients will have some level of meibomian gland disease, right. Whether it's strictly occlusion or whether it's a red hot posterior lid margin. Yeah. See, that's the other thing. When we think meibomitis, we all think an inflamed meibomian gland.
Right.
But you can have some patients who don't get that much inflammation from their meibomian gland involvement, but they get occlusion. And they won't produce any oils either. Now, the key then becomes to get that stuff emptied out of there. And by the way, I have a term for that because it's not strictly biofilm. It's not strictly meibum that becomes accumulated within the meibomian gland. It's a mixture. The biofilm invades the meibomians and mixes with biofilm. Mixes with meibum.
Yeah.
And that's why people say, well, it gets sludge-like. It's this diseased meibum that gets sludge-like. Well, what caused it to be diseased in the first place? Well, biofilm, because it mixes with the meibum. So I call that meibofilm to differentiate it from biofilm, which is on the lid margin.
Yeah, I like that. That's a nice, easy flowing combination of the words meibofilm.
Meibofilm. I think the words we use should help us to understand the disease.
Yeah, I agree. Because
it's not a pure biofilm within the meibomian glands. And it also allows us to understand one other thing. Am I going on too long here?
Please, keep going.
There's one other clinical presentation that we see that's also wrought with confusion, and that's what happens when you have diseases that are poorly understood. It's this nonsense about keratinization of the lid margin. Mm-hmm. Well, the back half of the eyelid margin has no keratin. There's no keratinized cells back there. It's not keratin that we're seeing when we're seeing those little domes, those little white domes, where every meibomian gland happens to be. And they've tried to convince us that for whatever reason, we're getting this keratinization that comes in and plops down over each meibomian gland. No one's ever proven it. There's no studies that prove it's keratin. But that's what someone said one time in a lecture, and it kind of caught on.
Mm.
Well, here's an alternative way of thinking about that. We have an eyelid that's had biofilm on it for years. The lashes are already involved. We got some folliculitis. The meibomian glands are accumulating meibofilm. Biofilm's getting there and mixing. The first thing it does is obstruct, right? You get the obstructed ductule. But that meibofilm, as it accumulates, it's still under positive pressure. The meibum is still being produced by the meibomian glands. Now, it's been proven that they're under positive pressure for efflux of the oil, correct? Mm-hmm. So as the meibofilm accumulates, where is it going to go? It's got nowhere to go but try to get up out of that ductule. Now, sometimes you'll get a chalazion. It'll pop through the wall of that meibomian. You'll get a nasty chalazion. Mm-hmm. That's from meibofilm exiting this impacted meibomian gland. But most of the time, it just tries to push its way up. Right. And you get a little white dome. Well, why do we get these little white domes? Why doesn't it just kind of come out and sort of spread out like toothpaste or mayonnaise or something on the lid margin? Why does it dome up? Well, it gets back to biofilm again. Think about taking your tube of toothpaste and wrapping the top of it with saran wrap. Mm-hmm. That's the original biofilm that's been there since nearly birth. And then giving the toothpaste tube a little squeeze. What are you going to get? You're going to get a dome of toothpaste because the saran wrap's holding it in, right? Mm-hmm. So the dome is simply just biofilm trapping meibofilm.
Right. I like that. And then that sounds intuitive to me and logical. In fact, if we're thinking about these structures and the layers that are there versus keratin, like you're saying. That's now, right. I'm curious when you sort of develop the DEBS theory and the stages, and since then, it's been years now. Has there been any pushback from others in the industry? And if you don't mind sharing, what type of counterpoints would others make, to say if they were trying to disprove the DEBS theory?
That's a great question. That takes me back a few years because it's been quite a while since I've gotten any pushback from that at all. I've heard all the questions and all the doubters. I've heard that during my first probably 3 or 4 years of lecturing about this new theory.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
The past 5-6 years haven't really gotten any pushback at all. We've got all the major MDs now subscribing to this theory. Donald, Donafil, we got Karpecki, Doug DeVries. Everyone hears it now and they think, that finally explains it. That makes sense. But early on, some of the pushback I got was, well, doctors said, well, okay, I can kind of get the lash folliculitis and okay, the meibomitis, yeah, maybe that's biofilm, but I can't get the aqueous part of it, right? Okay. I heard a lot of that, and I explained why that's harder to understand for some.
Right.
Some of the real early pushback I got was doctors just not believing there's biofilm there. They didn't know what biofilm. No one ever heard of biofilm in relationship to the eye. Mm-hmm. We have plaque on our teeth, but no one ever calls it biofilm. It's called plaque.
Right.
When I started saying, well, there's the scourge is really a biofilm, the questions I got were, what's biofilm?
Right.
Well, I had prominent MDs during some of my ad board meetings and my lectures, prominent MDs saying, well, what is biofilm? That was the first step to convince them that biofilm had to be there. There was a study that came out. It was very interesting. Curvank et al. Did a study that looked at patients going in for cataract surgery to see what bacteria survived the surgery. We do a surgical prep, then do a cataract surgery, and then we get them out of the OR. Well, what they did was on these cataracts, group of like 30 cataract patients, they swabbed the lid margin and the fornices before surgery, and then they swabbed it after surgery to see what bacteria had survived, if there were any still around. How effective were the lid scrubs? And it was something like, I don't know how many of the eyes, majority of the eyes grew out. I think it was 32 different types of bacterial species. So they swabbed them before they even went out of the OR and proved there were all these bacteria still living there, and that 90% of the bacteria they had isolated were biofilm formers. Well, that proves right there the bacteria living on our lid margin are biofilm formers. But that was the first hurdle I had to overcome, was convincing doctors that yes, indeed, bacteria in nature don't live without a biofilm, and this study proves it.
Mm.
So just this biofilm concept was the first big lift to
Yeah.
convince doctors that this was going on.
Right.
And since then, it's been more the aqueous, the virulence factors. That's been around since 1968. This quorum sensing gene activation. But once you understand those steps, suddenly the resistance just melts away. But you have to hear about it first.
Right.
A lot of doctors still don't know about this theory and don't know how much sense it makes in explaining dry eye and blepharitis.
Right.
I mean, the sooner we treat this disease, the better. And we haven't gotten into that yet, Harbert, but I guess you'd probably like to also discuss how to treat and when to treat.
Yes.
Is that next on your list of things to discuss?
That's basically yeah. That was perfect. That was a good segue. That's exactly what I wanted to get into was, if you could describe the way the BlephEx does this and removes the biofilm or treats this condition, and when and how often we should be getting this done on our patients.
Sure. Well, first I'm going to describe the perfect world, what we should be doing. Not only for ourselves, our practices, but primarily for our patients. And then we'll talk about reality. But in a perfect world, you get your driver's license, you start going in and getting your lids cleaned twice a year and never experience folliculitis, myopitis, or aqueous insufficiency. Just like we're all pre-programmed now to go to our dentist on a regular basis and get our teeth cleaned, so we have a good chance of keeping our own teeth in our head. Mm-hmm. It'll be the same thing for keeping our own meibomian glands functioning our entire life. Once we can educate the public that we need to go in early on, the earlier the better. I mean, as soon as you can sit still for it, but I picked the driver's license because that's a significant point in a young person's life. But if you can sit still at age 12, then start getting it at age 12. But every 6 months, getting lids clean. Now, that's what should be happening. We shouldn't have to even depend on making a diagnosis. BlephEx, in a perfect world, will become a preventative treatment like dental cleanings because it's the same thing. We're removing a biofilm to prevent it from causing chronic inflammation so we don't lose important structures. It's the exact same thing as dental cleaning, except the structure, instead of our teeth and our gingiva, the structures are meibomian glands and aqueous glands. Right. So that's in a perfect world. Every person that walks in, before they even see the doctor, they get their lids cleaned. Right. Where we are in reality is doctors are sometimes hesitant to have to sell something to patients. I have some doctors who they take to it like a duck to water. They have no problem. They understand the need for it, and they can convince the patient they have to get this done. I'm not just doing this to charge you something, patient. This is something you need to protect yourself going forward. Right. But I have doctors also that are a little bit squeamish about selling a cash pay procedure. Mm-hmm. So they wait for patients to become symptomatic. They think it'll make it easier to sell a procedure if the patient has symptoms. Right. The problem is, Javier, as you know, once a patient has symptoms of dry eye disease, well, you're behind the 8 ball at that point. Right. Right. For all you pilots out there, you're behind the power curve at that point. You're going to be saying hello to the ground very soon. The damage is already being done if you're waiting for symptoms. You already have destroyed meibomian glands. Your lashes are already falling out. You're already maybe entering into aqueous insufficiency because this disease is asymptomatic for so long. And the bacteria quietly go about building the biofilms, producing virulence factors, maybe causing an occasional irritation or an eye rubbing or a foreign body sensation or itching or whatever the symptom is, all the while doing damage to structures that you might not get back. Right. So that's the problem. Sure, BlephEx has been wildly successful. Patients or doctors are implementing it with their patients. And so easily they're symptomatic patients. We have a lot of MDs now who are mandating it prior to any LASIK or cataract surgery because it lessens that bacterial load, reduces chances of infection post-operatively. But where we really need to get to is preventative. Yeah, I like that. Patients, symptomatic, explain why they're symptomatic. Explain if you'd had BlephEx in your practice 5 years ago, you wish you'd had it then, you could have maybe prevented this at that point. But that's what we're faced with right now. So it's an education process. We need to educate patients that this is not something we're doing to treat your symptoms. This is something we're doing to prevent further damage. Your symptoms will be affected, sure. We want you to be better, absolutely. But we want to stop the damage while we can. And that's different for us doctors, right? We're used to reacting to disease and try to alleviate suffering. It's a whole new mindset to say we are now going to start preventing disease just like dentists.
Yeah.
We are really behind the dentist in that respect. I mean, think 40 years behind the dentistry. That's kind of depressing if you think about it. But you know something? Their efforts have worked, and it's manifested in looking at how many people actually have to wear full sets of dentures anymore. It's not that common. It used to be everyone had full sets of dentures by the time you were 50 or 60 years old. All of our founding fathers had full sets of dentures. Now, not so much anymore. We know good routine oral care, you have a good chance of dying with your own teeth in your head for the most part.
Right.
So you've got a lot of educating to do and a lot of catching up to do.
Absolutely. Anybody in the audience who's been following me for any period of time knows that education is one of the primary pillars for the way I approach everything. Patient education, public education is vital. Knowledge is power, as we always say. And until the person we're targeting understands what we're trying to do for them, is educated on, I like to really try to educate my patients on the mechanisms behind everything. So when I recommend a treatment and I tell them how the treatment works, they can put two and two together, and they're much more likely to understand and to be on board with it. And the other note is, I think optometry in general has been making a push towards becoming more preventative for years. It's funny you say we're 40 years behind dentists, but I think based on what Chris's numbers were, we're about probably 60 years, 50 or so years behind. We got a lot of catching up to do. But even, maybe to take it a step further here in Canada, based on our healthcare system, we are also, I think, a little bit more in tune with the preventative side of how we approach things. However, majority of, I'm going to include myself in this, a majority of us are squeamish, like you're saying, about the sales side of things, right? And that's another point where I believe dentists have come much further than we have. They present an option and they just say, here's how much it costs, end of story. Whereas many of us are kind of like, well, you have this thing. I could do this. It might cost you this much money. It's up. I don't know. What do you think? And you're never going to get anywhere with that.
That's exactly right.
And now I've personally, I'm very transparent. I've never been particularly, up until recently, very good with the sales side of things, but I've been trying to force myself to get a lot better. Part of the reason is because I've been trying to implement more dry eye into our practice. And we have, started to do a lot more patient education. We've also brought in some different treatment options, one of them being the Eyelid MGD treatment. So, of course, that's expressing the meibomian glands. And I was curious to hear your thoughts on how somebody, in my position, who's, I still think in very early stages of this process, what's the best way to implement the BlephEx? And do you feel that it complements these other devices? Do they work in conjunction with each other? What are your thoughts on that?
We're all agreeing here that education is paramount. And the other primary role the doctor has to play is get the patient to understand how important this is. Our patients are depending on us to educate them and to give them the latest and best treatment options. You have to be assertive. If you go in and you say, well, we can do this, or I can get a drop, or we go do some scrubs, patients are going to listen to that. They're going to say, well, this doctor doesn't really know what I need. I'll just pick the cheapest option. Because we're all into saving money. Patients depend on us to tell them the lay of the land, what we need to do. And if you haven't got a doctor that lays it out for you and is assertive with you, here's our only option at this point, or here's the first step we need to take, then I'm sorry, find another doctor, because it's our responsibility. This patient's lids and the meibomian glands and the lash follicles and the aqueous glands, those are our responsibilities. And if the patient loses those structures because we kind of sat back and we weren't firm enough with our patients, then that's on us. So educate the responsibility, but getting the point across. The doctor has to describe this procedure with the feeling that it's just as important to him as it is to the patient. Patient, I'm not going to sit by and let you lose all your meibomian glands, not on my watch, as the old saying goes, right? Not on my watch. You can go to someone else and they can sit there and watch your meibomian gland slowly atrophy over the next 20, 30 years.
Right.
I'm not going to allow that. If you want to stay my patient, here's what we're going to do. And you're going to thank me for it later. Yeah, it might cost a little bit, but you know something? It's a lot less expensive to have your lids cleaned twice a year than to go on artificial tears that you have to drop in your eyes every single day, and nighttime lubricating ointments, and all these other expensive treatments. And there's, these prescription medications now for dry eye disease that are only partially effective, and they burn and sting, and they're incredibly expensive. Actually, patient, you win in the long run as far as from a financial standpoint to simply get your lids cleaned twice a year and avoid all the other stuff.
Right.
Patients actually save money and get done what's supposed to be done. So that's the first step. Educate on the disease and then let patients know that you really have no other choice. This is something we have to do. Now, the first step on all these patients is a BlephEx, of course. Remove the surface biofilm from the lid margin. That's got to be first. Maybe if you catch it early enough, you could prevent it from getting down in the meibomian gland. That's key. Because once it gets in there, it's harder to get out. Now, once you have a patient with meibomian occlusion or meibomitis, now you need to do more of an expression procedure. First with the BlephEx, however, because now you remove the surface biofilm off the lid margin. Now when you do an expression, it's much easier to roll that meibofilm out of there. It's not still domed up under that original biofilm. Remove the original biofilm.
Right.
Remove that dome. Give the meibomian glands a chance to breathe a little bit. Then do your heat and express, be it a LipiFlow, be it an iLux, or if you haven't got either one of those, just even if it's a manual heat and express. Now, that's not ideal, but it's better than not doing anything. Get that meibofilm out of there because it's inflammatory. And if you're not seeing inflammation yet, you eventually will. So get that out of there. But that's going to depend on the exam. Now, if you have good puddles of meibum, you don't need to do that. Just do the BlephEx part of it.
Right.
We don't wait till we have symptoms before we start getting our teeth cleaned. We want to start early before symptoms. If you wait till you have symptoms, it's going to be too late to save a lot of your lid structures. The sooner you treat, the better. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's excellent advice. And so for the practitioner, of course, the recommendation is clean the biofilm first, uncover that surface, and then, if necessary, express the glands. It'll be a lot easier to express. Right.
That's exactly right.
Now, of course, BlephEx was the first, and maybe still is, I'm sorry if I'm not fully up to speed on that, the device that works in this particular manner, but there are other products on the market that are working to help clean the eyelid surface in different mechanisms, maybe just with a cloth and using different types of solutions and ingredients to help to clean that, which I imagine they're aiming for the biofilm as you've described it. Can you tell me where Blephex separates itself from those other products?
So that's a great question. So Zocular, I think it's a good product. It's a good product. It gets applied with a little brush that you manually brush off, which is better than not doing anything and probably better than a home scrub. What separates BlephEx, however, is that BlephEx is electromechanical. We're spinning a little sponge about 3,000 revolutions per minute with a lid scrub solution soaked in. So nothing can stand up to that. The swabs you use at home, like the little pads, you're not going to get rid of much biofilm that way. With the Q-tip, you're not going to get rid of much biofilm that way. The only way to really get rid of biofilm is to take an electrorotary tool and go after it.
Got it.
It's very comfortable, it's easy to tolerate, and it removes probably 90% of biofilm. Now, the biofilm will eventually come back. That's why you have to get it repeated. But our patent, not only here but also in Canada, covers electromechanical lid debridement. So while Zocular it's a nice solution, they use a brush to do it, it doesn't violate a patent because it's not electromechanical. But if there was any other electromechanical device on the market that's trying to do the same thing because they see our success, then they're either in court with us or will soon be in court with us, infringing our patent.
Got it.
We put a lot of time and work and effort into researching this, developing BlephEx, getting patents on it, and we will defend them every time something like that comes up.
Oh, that's excellent. Good. Thank you. I appreciate the the different points that distinguish the products that are available currently on the market. Now, moving on, I probably could spend a lot more time on this topic, and I'm sure there's plenty of my colleagues out there who would want to hear more on the science kind of thing and the dry eye side of thing. It's such a hot topic in our industry. Mm-hmm. But as I've explained to you previously, part of my podcast, in fact, a foundational part of my podcast, is to really discuss sort of the business side of things, how a business owner or CEO or somebody else who's been successful in a certain industry got to that position and some of the challenges they've faced along the way. So I'd love to hear, if you could, some challenges of being not just a CEO, but a founder as well, and then trying to continue that success over the years. If you're able to just tell me a few stories, if you're able to share something along the way that you've learned from.
Well, I tell you, I was in private practice for nearly 20 years. And private practice is a lot of work, especially solo practice. But nothing compares to the amount of work of running a company. Mm-hmm. It is a ton of work to develop a new product with a new theory, new treatment for that based on that theory, and then get that device manufactured and developed and regulatory. It's a ton of work. Regulatory is one of the biggest hurdles to have to overcome. I mean, it's unbelievable the amount of paperwork you have to go through with not only the federal government here, but to get your product also placed overseas. Mm-hmm. The regulatory is a real problem. And then there's legal challenges every time you turn around. There's always some kind of attorney with his hand in your pocket, regardless of what the issue is. So it's been a ton of work, but I've actually had more fun running this company than I really ever had in private practice. It feels like it was something I was made for, but I just didn't know it at the time. Mm-hmm. I was just happy doing my LASIK surgery, my cataract surgery, and glaucoma surgery. My best days were when I could spend all day in the OR. But nothing beats this. So even though it's a ton of work, I'm really enjoying it a whole lot more. Now, when you say business aspect, I mean, from my aspect of running my business, or you mean from an optometrist business aspect of implementing BlephEx?
No, from your personal experience of being a business owner.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's been great. Now, this COVID-19 stuff has been no fun to go through. When offices shut down, we shut down, right? Mm-hmm. No one's doing any BlephEx procedures on patients if you have no patients in your office. So we weather the storm. We do what we can to take care of as best we can our employees. So everyone's still on the same team. But we just have to sit back, hunker down, and wait for this to resolve itself, which I think is going to happen within the next few months. Yeah. But running this business has been a great thing for me. I'm traveling more than ever, going to trade shows. I know more doctors now than I ever knew when I was actually practicing medicine. And now, we're closely associated with really the leading MDs and ODs in the field. And if you had told me 10 years ago that I could count as my best friends now, Dr. Donenfeld, Dr. Karpecki, Dr. DeVries, Dr. Hovnessian, Dr. Margaret McDonald, Ed Holland, say, oh, no, those guys are way up there. What are you talking about? Yeah. I'm just this general ophthalmologist now, just, trying to look for my next 4+ NSC cataract. I wouldn't have believed you if you had told me that. So it's a different world. It's a whole different world. Yeah. But I'm really loving it. If you had told me I'd be lecturing to all the aforementioned doctors plus, crowds of others, auditoriums in China with 1,000 doctors packed in, all listening to my lectures, going to Spain and lecturing, going to Australia. If you had told me that, I'd say you're nuts. Mm. I don't know dry eye disease better than anybody else.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but it so happens that I do now, and I'm happy to share that knowledge and that wisdom with really whoever is interested. And just before I forget about it, anytime I do one of these, I always like to give my personal email address out. I don't mind doctors or patients emailing me. I have now ongoing dialogues with patients really around the world that enjoy talking to the founder of BlephEx. So my email address, my personal email is D as in David, OC, JMRMD @gmail.com.
Perfect.
And anybody's welcome to email me with any questions or you want to discuss dry eye disease. I love that. Or talk about biofilms. Just shoot me an email and I'd be happy to respond.
That's perfect. Thank you for sharing that. I was definitely going to ask you towards the end. I might ask you to repeat it one more time towards the end. We just have a couple more questions as we head towards wrapping up. But I really appreciate those insights, the difference between being a practicing MD and now being the CEO spot that you're in and all the it's hard work, but all of the blessings, if you will, that have come with it. That's really, really cool to hear. So normally I finish off with two very specific questions I ask all my guests, but I've recently added a third just based on our time that we're in. It's such a unique period of time in all of our lives. So I'll start with this one. What would you say is the number one silver lining for you during the self-isolation and quarantine period?
Number one silver lining. Well, I'll tell you what, one thing it does, it allows my operations guy to get caught up. That's a silver lining.
For sure.
We're not packing and shipping many orders. So he's able to go through and organize his books on the computer, organize our warehousing, streamline some things, figure out better ways of doing things. Everyone can just kind of take this forced breath, this forced pause, if you will, and take another look at how we do things. It also allows us to go through and look at our expenses, because it's the same business. If you're not making any revenue, you better figure out a way to cut expenses. So it allows us to go through and target things, and we might find an item and say, well, why are we paying for that? We don't really need that. And so you can actually whittle away at some of your expenses is a nice little plus, I guess.
Yeah.
But I really don't think there's any pluses that overcome the suffering and the misery that some of the patients have had to go through.
For sure. Yeah.
This, so I don't spend much time thinking about that. In fact, I wouldn't call it a silver lining. I'd call it maybe a gray lining. Because there's nothing really that's great that's going to come out of this.
Yeah.
But I do think we'll come out of it. And I think that on the other end, we'll be right back up and going, really right back where we were in no time.
Right. Absolutely. So the official two final questions of the podcast. Number one is, if we could hop in a time machine and you could take yourself back to a point in your life where you were struggling, you were in a particular difficult point. You could share that moment if you'd like, but more importantly, what I'd like you to share is the advice that you would give yourself at that point in time.
Yeah, I guess the advice I would give myself would be really to apply myself better and get there quicker. So, my first going through college, I didn't really apply myself. I didn't make the grades I should have made. I got into the restaurant industry for a while. I was a busboy, then a waiter, then a bartender. I can remember a period living in a little one-room apartment under railroad tracks that would keep you up all night long, and wondering if I was going to make my next month's rent. Then deciding to go back to school, do it the right way, apply myself, study 24/7 for the MCAT test, and see if I could finally fulfill my dream of getting into medical school. So I would advise everybody out there, if you have a dream and you have something you want to be 20 years from now, then start taking the steps right now that are necessary to get to that point in your life. Because who you are in 40 years, or when you're 40 or whatever age you are, you're making that decision now with the actions you take immediately. So we all have different paths. Choose the path that will take you there. Right? Don't take a bunch of other paths and experiment with this and experiment with that and waste a bunch of years. You can still have fun. You can still enjoy life, but take steps that get you to that point where you want to be 20 years from that spot in your life. So do it right. Do it the first time. Apply yourself, and don't let anyone tell you can't do it. There's always a way to achieve what you want to achieve. You can do it. You got to be focused, and you got to stay on target. That's my best advice I can give anyone.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you for sharing that. That I'm not sure how many people know that part of your history. That was definitely new for me to hear. So I appreciate you sharing that with me, and that's very motivating and inspiring, and I'm sure a lot of others will find it so. The last question that I like to ask is everything that you've accomplished, and you certainly have accomplished quite a lot. I'd like to ask you, how much of that would you say is due to luck, and how much is due to hard work?
Well, I'd say 90% of it is just due to hard work and perseverance. I was lucky that no one else thought about BlephEx before I did. So that's luck.
Sure, fair enough.
And I guess I was lucky to finally say, enough of this, doing, odd jobs and bartending and being happy with a C average in college and deciding to apply myself. To anyone out there who's maybe even if you have some younger students, or if you have parents watching who have kids in school, and they have a dream they want to accomplish, but they're just not quite doing it. I went from my first go around to college from C average to when I went back and decided to apply myself, I was not just a straight A average, I was at the top of my class in every single class. And the only difference is that I decided to apply myself. I decided to get serious about life and apply myself and outwork everybody else. You know, half of it is your intelligence and your smarts, and the other half is just how hard you're willing to work. And if you're willing to work, then you can take the smarts you have and do anything you want. You don't have to depend on luck. That certainly helps, you know. I had one of my old ophthalmology professors who always said, well, it's better to be lucky than good. Well, okay, that may well be, but let's don't depend on luck.
Yeah.
Depend on your own motivation and your own smarts and your own work ethic.
Right. That's a wonderful answer. Thank you very much. And we've shared it once, but if you could share with us how can people get in touch with you, if you don't mind sharing your email address with us one more time, please.
Sure. It's D as in David, O-C, J, M as in Mary, R, M as in Mary, D as in David, at gmail.com. docjmrmd at gmail.com.
Got it. docjmrmd at gmail.com. And any last words you'd like to share with us before we end the interview? Any information that you'd like to get out there before we wrap up?
Sure. Any of you patients out there that are wondering, why you're suffering so long and nothing's being done to help your dry eyes, ask your doctor about getting a BlephEx procedure. If your doctor doesn't have it, suggest he get it. I've got a 5-year-old. I got to buy him books. He's got college fund we're trying to fund, right? So tell your doctor to get a BlephEx machine first of all. He's going to help a lot of his patients.
Yeah.
If your doctor's out there and you haven't got a BlephEx, you're not offering the best care you possibly can to your patients. Get a BlephEx. Take the first step towards alleviating your patient's suffering and protect their glands from future damage. And that's my parting thought. It's all about education. It's all about wanting to prevent disease instead of reacting to it. And patients, do not be satisfied with not having your disease prevented. Insist that you get it.
Right. Absolutely. That's perfect. Thank you again, Dr. Rynerson, for joining me on the 2020 podcast. I appreciate all the amazing insights and the education that you have imparted on me. I appreciate that. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk again soon.
Anytime, Harvey. I appreciate you having me. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, take care. Goodbye, everybody.